This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Like Progressive home and auto policies, they're best when they're bundled too. Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
This is No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to our Unabridged episode with John Blake. John's an award-winning journalist. Recently released a moving memoir entitled More Than I Imagined: What a Black Man Discovered About the White Mother He Never Knew. This was truly a page-turner at points memoir, and a fascinating twist on so many ways we give narratives to race in our country. A beautiful story, moving story, and I really very much enjoyed my interview with John. Enjoy, John Blake. John Blake is an award-winning CNN journalist, especially writing on race, religion, and politics. Previously, John was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He's been honored by numerous organizations, including the Associated Press, the Society of Professional Journalists, the American Academy of Religion, and the National Association of Black Journalists. He's a native of Baltimore, Maryland, now lives in Atlanta, Georgia. And today we're discussing his memoir, More Than I Imagined: What a Black Man Discovered About the White Mother He Never Knew. And that new memoir has been the recipient of 3 prestigious awards: the Christopher Award, the Illumination Award, and the Nonfiction Authors Association Award. All high, lovely recognition of such good work. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I told you before we started that I really am grateful for your book, and I found myself numerous times as I was reading it when I'd have to take a break and go do other work, thinking I've got to get back to that book because I've got to find out what happens.
Yeah.
And so, well, we're grateful for the work and the vulnerability that you share throughout the book, which we'll have hopefully opportunity to talk about some of that. But I suppose in one way, you have a number of threads that run throughout the book, but perhaps maybe the story of your father and his absence, I guess, in your early life looms large in the story. So how would you kind of frame that for listeners who've not yet had the opportunity to read your book?
Okay, so yes, my father was a huge presence in my life, and in a way, he was a huge presence because he was absent often, and he was also a huge presence because of the way he lived and for the fact that he chose to be with my mom. So I was born in the mid-60s when interracial marriage was illegal in much of the country. And my father chose to date and see a young Irish Catholic woman in Baltimore. And so when I grew up though not having both my mother and father present. It was a weird way to grow up because when I grew up, I spent most of my time in a foster home. And when my father would spend most of his time traveling overseas. He was a merchant seaman. So he'd be going like 6 or 7 months out of the year. And then he would come back. Then he would stay for a month or two. And so I would spend time with him growing up. But the big absence of my childhood was my mom. I knew I had a white mother, and he would tell me that, your mother's white. Her name is Shirley, and her family hates Black people. But that's all I knew. Mm-hmm. There was no picture of her around the house. I didn't know what she looked like. I couldn't remember the sound of her voice. So I was trying to figure out why my mother wasn't there, why her family hated Black people, and doing that while trying to cope with the frequent long absences of my father.
Yeah, I certainly want to come back and ask follow-up questions about your mother. But before we get there,
sure.
You tell some, I think harrowing is not too strong of a term, harrowing stories about some of your experiences in foster care with someone you called Aunt Fanny. Aunt Fanny as one of those that a place that you stayed. But to whatever degree you feel comfortable talking about this in that context, about that in this context, what are some of the kind of memories that stand out to you in that part of your life, that season of your life?
When I think about staying in a foster home for most of my childhood, and Aunt Fanny, I think of it's like one of those stories from Charles Dickens. The kid who you feel like the kid feels like the whole world has deserted him or her, and they have to deal with this villain as a kid, this adult who's cruel to them. And Aunt Fanny was like that type of character to me. She was a Black woman who ran a foster home in West Baltimore where I grew up, and she was very cruel. So it was hard enough dealing with the absence of my mother and often the frequent absences of my father. But to deal with Aunt Fanny was even worse. And she was just a very cruel woman who didn't really care for kids. And when I stayed there, she could be physically abusive. She was definitely emotionally abusive. But when I think back to those foster care, I remember as a kid, I would look at the calendar a lot, and I would think, this isn't going to last, that one day in this year, I'm going to be 18, I'm going to be an adult, and I'll be able to escape. So I was always imagining that I would leave that place. I would leave Aunt Fanny, and I wouldn't have to deal with that misery I wouldn't have to deal with that misery all the time.
Yeah.
But I guess one of the things I also remember about Aunt Fanny is that I had a lot of time on my hand. Like kids today, there's so many distractions, phones, gadgets. So I had a lot of time on my hand. That's when I fell in love with books. So books became my escape in those foster homes. So when I was reading those books, Aunt Fanny was there physically, but my mind was elsewhere. I was with Davy Crockett. I was with Audie Murphy in World War II. I was imagining a different life for myself.
Yeah, you say at one point that you became a scavenger, like a young Robinson Crusoe, pieced together any scraps of hope I could find, with books being one of those. You also tell a story about a gentleman named Mr. Bill that kind of wanders into that home. Yeah.
So in this really cruel place, like whenever I thought of Aunt Fanny's house, even today, I remember it being always dark, curtains closed, pretty quiet, just a very oppressive, sad place because there were other foster kids in there with us whose parents had abandoned them. And nobody really laughed or smiled. But one day, this elderly gentleman named Mr. Bill moved in, and I don't know if he was Aunt Fanny's boyfriend or friend, but every time he would see us, he would smile and light up and just be nice to us. And he had this ritual where at night he would go into the kitchen and he would take out his Bible and he would sing this hymn, I Surrender All, in this like very white baritone. And he would be singing about, I surrender to Jesus. And as a kid, I would like, why is he surrendering? Did he do something wrong? But the significant thing about Mr. Bill is that even after all these years, is that when you're a kid and you're in a place like that, an abusive place, sometimes all you need is that one adult to show you a little warmth and friendliness, and you hold on to it. You clutch onto it like a lifeline. And Mr. Bill was a kind of a lifeline to me. He let me know that there are other people outside that world that could be kind to me.
Yeah. When you think back to having to find your way through such a difficult experience, what particular skills or disposition do you think that fostered in you to help you develop resilience in particular?
That's a good question. I think one, what I kind of alluded to, is one that I instinctively knew how to kind of form alliances with adults that would see potential in me. Like whether it was a Mr. Bill or a teacher at school that would say, you're smart, you can be somebody. So it's almost like I recruited adults to be surrogate parents to me. So finding adults that would believe in me was one skill, I think. I think another one that I already alluded to was the use of imagination. To imagine that there would be a different future, something different, and losing myself in stories. But they weren't just any stories, they were particular type stories. I love stories from the Old Testament, stories from Greek mythology, and these were stories of heroes going through trials, and they had to develop resilience, and they had to be hope. I love the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, who was betrayed by his family and brother and sent off to another land in Egypt. And I felt like I was abandoned by my family and sent off. But Joseph was redeemed, and maybe that I would be redeemed in the future. So a third skill is just losing yourself in certain type of stories that where you absorb these psychological coping mechanisms. You don't even know it when you're reading it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. If we turn that around and look at it from a different angle, I've heard therapists and folks in recovery sometimes say that a lot of times as kids, we can pick up certain coping mechanisms that might work for us as kids, but then we discover that they don't work for us as adults.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Are there things like that you can identify for yourself that you had to learn to maybe that worked for me well when I was younger, but didn't work so well for you as you moved into adulthood?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. No one's ever asked me that, and I've actually thought about it. And something I will often say to my wife is that a strength can easily become a weakness in different settings.
Yeah.
So certain things that worked for me as a kid, I had to unlearn as an adult. And so one of them, I think, is that as a kid, I learned how to be by myself and depend on myself and not open up to people and not be vulnerable. Because I couldn't really express my emotion in those settings when my mom is not I don't know where my mom is. I don't know if she's alive. I don't know why she doesn't want me. I couldn't sit around and cry about it. So I had to kind of bottle up that emotion. And that kind of helped me deal with it as a kid. But as an adult, when you have to form relationships, where you have to show your feelings, that's not good. So I had to kind of learn how to show my emotions and to be vulnerable. And if you would have told me as a kid that I would have written about all this and to be that vulnerable, I'm like, no way. But yeah, you just, certain things work in certain circumstances, but you have to evolve and adapt in others. And that was true for me.
Yeah. Chapter 2 is entitled Black Boy, White Boy. And so you draw this kind of heart-wrenching picture where you're getting othered, we might say. You're getting othered from kind of both directions. So describe that kind of doubly, maybe even triply being othered as that unfolds for you.
So I talk about in that chapter about being a biracial kid. And that chapter might seem strange to some people today because being biracial is not only widely accepted, it's almost like, it's almost fashionable. I mean, we have people like Obama, Kamala Harris, Jordan Peele. We go around, you're from Alabama. I bet you could go to Talladega, you would see biracial couples walking out in public with their kids and nobody thinks twice about it. But in the world I grew up in, none of that existed. Like literally when I was born, interracial marriage was illegal. And so in the world I grew up inner city Baltimore, but it's a particular type of neighborhood in Baltimore. It's called West Baltimore, and it's very infamous. It's infamous because it's one of the most violent Black neighborhoods in the country. And so I grew up in this all Black neighborhood where nobody liked white people, knowing that I had a white mother. And so what I did, I became what I call a closeted biracial person. I wouldn't tell anybody that my mom was white. I would mark her race as Black on school forms. But yet people suspected that that I wasn't all Black because they would see with my father, who was very dark. And so frequently I found myself the victim of prejudice from Black people. But at the same time, I had this whole white family that wanted nothing to do with me because of their own prejudice. So it created this sense like, where do I belong? And so it's a very strange environment to kind of grow up in.
Yeah. You said at one point that you found yourself picking up a measure of what you called ambient racism.
Yes.
Would you describe that for us?
Well, if I can remember, the reference is one of the things that I learned about racism, and that's something I've had to think about and deal with all my life, is that a lot of racism is not so much taught, it's caught. It's like in my environment, this is a weird thing. Here I am with a white mom and a white family, but I grew up with this tremendous hostility toward white people. And nobody set me down and said, you must hate white people. It was just ambient. It was part of the atmosphere in my neighborhood. You just absorbed this hatred toward white people. It was like the humidity, it just got into your pores. And as you heard it when you picked up what certain people said things or certain conversations. And also I would see things. I would see white police officers brutalize unarmed black people in front of me. But a lot of it, what I was trying to convey in that phrase is that you absorb these attitudes about race and another group of people, and you're not even aware of it. If you had came up to me when I was like 16 and 15 and said, you're prejudiced toward white people, you hate all white people, I wouldn't even know what you were talking about. It's not something I thought about. It was just the way everybody thought of my neighborhood, so I thought the same way.
Did you also pick up, I think that there was also a passage in the book where you also indicated that you found yourself sometimes picking up prejudice towards blacks. Did I remember that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. And I talk about it particularly later on because I have this encounter with a white relative who denied me, shunned me at birth, wanted nothing to do with me, and was clearly very racist against black people. And I thought I was nothing like her. And something happened to me where I caught myself racially profiling a black person. And it just shocked me. And it humbled me. And what that also taught me is that, racism is so powerful that people of color absorb it. For example, there was a guy named Tyree Nichols, a black man who was beaten to death in Memphis by several police officers. The police officers who beat him to death were black police officers. So racism is so powerful that even the victims of it can absorb it. And that definitely happened to me. And the odd thing is that a white relative revealed to me my own racism.
You tell about Aunt Sylvia.
Oh, yeah.
And beautiful stories about Aunt Sylvia, who figures as a very redemptive character in your childhood. What stands out to you about Aunt Sylvia as I raise her name?
Yeah, when I think of Aunt Sylvia, I think of something my younger brother Patrick told me, because he shared all this with me. Often we were the only ones, we only had one another at often. And he would say that when you're a kid in a tough situation, that sometimes all you need is that one adult who believes in you, just that one person. And Aunt Sylvia was that one person who believed in me. She was a lighthouse in a sea of chaos. And she was the surrogate mom that stepped into that void when I was a kid. I would see her on the weekends. And it was only 2 days out of the week, but it was everything to me. She taught me to love books. She taught me to think about my future. She exposed me to church and to faith. And though at the time as a kid, I hated going to church, there were certain spiritual skills that I picked up that I didn't even know because of Aunt Sylvia. And so she was a black woman who never married, who never had kids. But we became her surrogate kids. It's like we all filled voids for one another. We didn't have a mom. She became our mom. She didn't have kids. We became our kids. And without her, I don't know what I would have done. But I think a lot of people know someone like that in their life. And Aunt Sylvia, somebody who just saw something in them as a kid and made all the difference.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned West Baltimore a moment ago, but at one point you say, West Baltimore, one of the highest murder rates in the nation, and had become a symbol of black criminality and urban decay. It was the setting for the brutal HBO series The Wire. It had also become a popular conservative talking point. Here's what happens when black mayors run black cities with so-called failed liberal policies. And so this is the neighborhood in which you were raised, and you talk about having to navigate this context of violence and drugs, and yet it was Aunt Sylvia that helped you navigate that. But then you raised the question, but what happens to kids who don't have an Aunt Sylvia? What did you see there with kids who didn't have an Aunt Sylvia?
Well, I saw what happened to a lot of those kids is that they perished. And I had one that was I had several friends that were murdered. And I had a close relative, a nephew, who was just as smart, just as gifted as I was, who died of a drug overdose. So when I tell people sometimes that I come from the neighborhood I come from, sometimes people are surprised. And they like, what happened to you? And I said, well, I had an Aunt Sylvia. I had some lucky things that happened to me, but I was not particularly smart or gifted in my neighborhood. There were many people that were smarter than I was. And Michael, my nephew, was one of them. But because he did not have that Aunt Sylvia, his parents died when he was young. He didn't have that person to kind of reach down and say, you can be somebody who could teach him what his gifts were. And so particularly if you're a black kid, a black boy, or a young black man, the margin for error in those environments is just very small. It's so easy to end up dead, to end up on drugs, to end up in jail. It almost takes a little bit of a luck that you don't. And Michael, my nephew, was one of those because he didn't have an Aunt Sylvia. And I try to go deeper to that in my story. So a lot of the stories that come up from my neighborhood are stories of violence, as I mentioned. But to me, the type of violence that I really remember is kind of more of an internal violence, where I said that people's dreams were murdered before they could even take flight. And that what I'm trying to say is you don't believe that you'll never escape in a world like that. I didn't believe I could go to college. I never thought of being a journalist. I definitely never thought of being an author. So there was this external struggle where you're dealing with violence and drugs, abuse of police, but there was also this internal struggle to believe that you could be more than what you were, that you could escape that world. And that internal struggle was just as fierce.
That phrase that you just used, it really caught my attention, that the margin of error for young men without an Aunt Sylvia was very small. And even in our conversation now, it's this notion that if we can all kind of just contribute to help various folks have a little bit larger margin for error, the profound impact that could have upon so many people.
Yes.
And you have these one, this individual here and this individual here that chooses to help make a contribution to that margin, and what a profound impact that has.
Yeah. I think
it's a compelling invitation, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, for an adult, like take Mr. Bill, for example. I don't think Mr. Bill ever knew what kind of impact he had on me. All he would do was smile at me, talk to me, and sing hymns in the kitchen at night. But that kindness made a huge difference for me. So I don't think adults realize that you can show a kid in that environment just a little bit of kindness, that they will hold on to that, and that could make a huge difference to them later on.
Yeah, that's lovely. So then we've alluded to your mom, but we haven't yet talked about your mother. And so you as a young person, you're asking your father, you're asking your family members about your mother, and you're not getting much information. You've not met her. But then one day your dad just says, do you want to meet your mom?
Yeah, my father was a merchant seaman. He wasn't very sensitive or introspective. So we go throughout my childhood where I literally have no picture of my mom. I don't think she's alive. All I know is that her family is racist and they hate black people. And one day when I'm 17 on my way to go to college, my father calls me up into his bedroom. He's sitting on the bed with his shirt off, his belly hanging out. He's looking at The Price is Right on television. And he just casually says to me, do you want to meet your mom? And I don't know what to say. But that was how I met my mom. And 3 days later, I go and meet my mom, and the meeting is nothing. It's nothing what I expected. It's incredibly shocking. And but that's how it started with my father's casual question.
Yeah. Yeah, as you shared the story in the book, you and your brother, your younger brother Pat, right?
Yeah.
And is it another half sibling or an
Yeah,
aunt that
Lenny,
also
you're
goes with?
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
my
yeah,
sister drove us there to meet my mom.
yeah, and then you find yourself um, at a very unexpected place.
I mean, I could tell the story if you want. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know.
please.
Yeah, so 3 days after my father asked, "Do you want to meet your mom?" I find myself in the car with my brother, and we're being driven out to the outskirts of Maryland. I live in Baltimore. We're driven out to the countryside, and we're driven to this really menacing looking red brick building. It looks like the set for the Shawshank Redemption. It's just a very
Mm.
miserable looking place. And I'm numb. All these feelings are going through my mind. I tell people that if a dinosaur rumbled across the path of the car, I wouldn't have noticed. I was just my mind was reeling. I didn't know what I was going to see or hear. And we walk into this waiting room, and it's like the waiting room of a hospital or something, because we see people in white hospital orderly uniforms go by. And we could hear people screaming in the background, and others were like laughing hysterically. But I still don't quite get where I am. The door opens, and this hospital orderly escorts this very thin white woman into the room. And when she looks at me, her eyes light up. She's very thin, probably weighs about 110 pounds at that point, very gaunt. She has these baggy clothes on. It looks like it's donated by Goodwill. And her eyes light up when she sees me, and she kind of half shuffles and half approaches me. And she hugs me. She says, "Oh boy, John. Oh boy, Pat, it's so good to see you."
Mm.
And that's my mom. But what was so shocking about it wasn't just the suddenness of the meeting, but where we met. We were in the waiting room of a mental institution. And my mom was there because she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And all that, I made that realization right then and there. No one told me in my family. No one told, your mom is sick, be prepared. I didn't make that discovery until I saw in the waiting room of that
Wow.
mental institution. So it was just a flood of emotions and feelings. But one of the things I really remember about that is that seeing how fragile she was, and realizing that she had not abandoned us, that she had been taken from us in part because of this illness, and realizing that she had been in this miserable place for all these years. I was like, I didn't know that a white person could suffer like that. You see, in my world that I grew up in, no white person could understand what it meant to suffer like a black person, to be kind of looked down upon because of how you looked or your skin color. But they could not understand what we went through. But when I saw my mom, she shattered all those assumptions within like 15 or 20 minutes of the meeting, and she didn't even say a word. So that was the beginning when I started to shift my attitudes toward white people. And that started with my mom.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, in some ways, it seems that, as we said earlier, you're dealing with the kind of black boy, white boy dynamic, and then this kind of lays on a third layer, I suppose, of especially in this particular decade, in which that kind of mental illness would have carried with it such stigma.
Yes.
How did that add a layer of complexity to your finding your place in the world?
Well, it was like a double dose of shame. I was ashamed of my mom at first for being white. And now I meet her at 17 years old. I'm ashamed of her for having this mental illness. So I didn't want to tell anybody about her, and I didn't tell anybody. I tell you how weird it was. Even later on as an adult, when I got married, I would not allow my wife to meet my mom for like 4 years. It took a long time because I was ashamed, because as you said, there was such a stigma around mental illness. I mean, you think there's a stigma with skin color. I would argue that people who have mental illness, particularly those who have severe mental illness, they're the most stigmatized group in this country. And so to try to answer your question, the layer it added is that it created this sense of empathy in me. I began to start to kind of get outside of my own anger and my own wounds when I began to see how much my mom had suffered. And so it began to change me. And I would begin to see something that I would experience again and again. And that is, and I'm a big believer in this, is that the thing that really changes people's attitudes, whether it comes to race or anything, it's not a book you read. It's not going to a protest. It's not going to a diversity workshop. It's encountering other people. It's relationships. And that relationship that I had with my mom as it began to develop changed me in ways I never expected. So what I try to tell people all the time is facts don't change people, relationships do. And my mom and her mental illness, she was the first one to show me that, to teach me that.
You share some very powerful, distressing and powerful stories about things that once you began to learn about your mom, and then in time you began to learn more about the courtship between your mom and your dad.
Yeah.
Would you unpack some of that for us and things that you learned and what you learned about them and the kind of positive character traits that you finally began to see in them that related to the fact that they would be together?
Yeah, I'm still trying to digest the lessons learned from what they did because it was so courageous. Again, today, for a lot of people, to say that a Black man went out with a white woman sounds like nothing. But in those days, in the mid-60s, when my parents did it, a Black man could literally get killed for doing so. Like, for example, in 1968, I mentioned this, Herb Belafonte, the Black activist, was doing a variety show on television. He was doing a duet with a white singer, and she touched his arm, and that ignited this huge scandal, international scandal. And so that was the environment. So to answer your question, my parents grew up in this world where these divisions between white and Black were violently enforced. And in fact, when my father first went to visit my mom, her father physically attacked him, called him the N-word, and had him arrested. And so what struck me is not that just that happened, but they continue to have abuse like that, experience that kind of abuse, police stopping them, people assaulting them, cab drivers not picking them up, but that they continue to see one another despite that. And particularly my mom, she defied her family and her community. And she would walk into this all Black neighborhood by herself, a young white woman, and knock on the door to see my father. That was incredible. And I asked my relatives, I said, was she nervous? What did y'all think? They said people couldn't understand it. They would look at her walk by, and they said that she seemed totally comfortable. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. And so for me, the significance of all that is, for my mom, I think about the courage she had. And what I like to think about is that she knew how the world was in the country at that point, but she could imagine that the country would change and there would be another future. And just by those simple acts of defying all those customs, to loving who she wanted to love, regardless of her skin color, she was helping making that future happen through these actions. And my parents were part of this vanguard of white and Black couples who did the same thing all around the country. They ignored the laws, they ignored the ostracism, and they said, this is right. Love is love, regardless of skin color. And I'm going to be with the person I love, even if I have to pay a price. So that's what I think about, that she could imagine something different for this country in the future. That kind of optimism that drove her to take those risks.
Yeah. You also play out how you think perhaps part of this on your father's side is that he had experienced in the merchant marine a social context that most of the country at that point didn't know yet. That then perhaps fueled this sort of presumption on his part that if I love this woman, I'm going to pursue a relationship with her. So would you unpack that a little bit for us? Because I would imagine a lot of people don't know the stories about the merchant marine and the impact that had on the United States history in this regard.
So one of the things I could never understand about my father is why he was, to be blunt, to me, he would take such crazy risk. Like, why would he risk so much to be with my mom? He was attacked physically. But it wasn't just with my mom. It was the way he lived. He lived totally free, which was unusual for a Black man in that time. People in my family would tell stories about him standing up to police officers, talking back. He didn't seem to live in fear of white people. But even more important, I never heard him express any hatred toward white people, use slurs. He just seemed to be free. And I could never figure that out until much later as an adult. I was reading this incredible book called The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon Allport, the psychologist. And he told this story about what happened when the Merchant Seamen Union tried to integrate before World War II. There was tremendous resistance among white sailors, but the leaders insisted, no, you're going to have these black sailors that are going to sail with you. And so it went through. So in the 1940s, years before the military officially integrated, which was in 1948, you had black sailors sailing on these ships across the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats, sailing with white sailors. And what Gordon Allport said in his book is that created these conditions where these white sailors who were once, very prejudiced, didn't want the black sailors on the ship with them. But once these black sailors started getting on the ship with them, sharing the same risk, that prejudice evaporated. My father was one of those first black sailors that sailed with those white men. And I think what it did to him, it created this freedom, this courage in him. He wasn't intimidated by white people. He didn't hate them all. And I think it's because you could not find a more integrated space for a black man in the mid-20th century than a deck of a merchant marine ship. And that really profoundly shaped him and gave him the courage to see my mom, despite what happened to him, from her family and other people in public.
On your father, at one point, you say that your father said, "I never hated white people. I hated the system." And then later in the book, you say, "There are people who say that if white and non-white people just learn to love one another, like my mother's family and I have learned, racism will eventually disappear. They see racism primarily as a problem of the heart." But then you go on to say, "But that's not enough. A hug would not have allowed my paternal grandmother to buy a home in Roland Park," which you've described as a white neighborhood in Baltimore. "A hug would not have allowed my paternal grandmother to buy a home in Roland Park and build up generational wealth for our family. It was against the law." I think that's a very helpful, succinct way of saying a lot of important things. So obviously in your book, and you've already said this, right, that it's more than books, it's more than diversity workshops, it's relationships. But even with relationships, there's still even something more than that we still need to kind of continue to make progress. And it's changes to systems or changes to laws. But further commentary on any of that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was very important for me to say, because I tell people my story is dangerous in a way because it's talking about this dreaded phrase that people don't like to use anymore, and that is racial reconciliation. And that sounds so cynical to say that. But what I have found is that when you tell stories about white and black people finding commonality across these divisions, I think a lot of people see those stories as naive and inconsequential. They will say, well, how is that going to change systemic racism? How is that going to stop George Floyd from being killed? And so the point I was trying to make in that story is that you need both. It can't just be, I want to change laws and policy. You also have to change people in the relationships and create those interracial communities. But it also just can't be, be friends with white people and don't worry about issues of justice. You need both. And what I think has happened with people who fight against racial justice in recent years is that they've forgotten the importance of the relationships. No, I mean, anybody can talk about systemic racism now. I mean, people can talk with fluency about these racial concepts. They can talk about redlining. They can talk about mass incarceration. But I think what people have forgotten is that you still need to have situations where people have to form relationships and be in those type of communities. Those are the things that change racial attitudes too. So you need both, not one, but you need both. And that's why I put that in the book. I didn't want people to feel that I was implying in my story, look, I made friends with the white family that hated me, systemic racism disappears. I'm saying you need both.
Yeah. Thank you. In your you leave Baltimore and go to school at Howard University, and one of the most prestigious colleges in the country. And one, I suppose, unexpected part of what happens with you there in college, a number of things you share, but one in particular that stands out prominently is your discovery of Christian faith, or your beginning to take Christian faith seriously.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, theology's my academic area, and one of the things that's always striking to me is that a given tradition can mean very different things to different practitioners depending upon the particular lenses or the things that they focus on out of that tradition, or in that tradition. And one of the things that stands out in your story is that one of the things that begins to stand out to you is this beautiful element of the Christian tradition that will say things like, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, bond or free, but we're all one. That there's this possibility of unity and this possibility of breaking down divisions. But you want to unpack some of that for us, or talk about that?
Yeah, you're asking some really good questions. What I encountered when I went to college, a friend of mine just knocked on my dorm room one night, had a Bible in his hand and said, "You want to come to a Bible study?" I literally laughed in his face, but I said, "Why not? Let me humor him." And because I didn't want anything to do with religion. And like a lot of Black people, I saw Jesus as this white, blue-eyed person who had been used to justify slavery. I wanted nothing to do with that. But as I started to go to the Bible study with him, and I actually started reading a little bit of the New Testament and start reading about Jesus, the story was not what I expected. The story resonated with me because I saw this person who broke barriers. There were all these divisions in that world, like ethnic divisions, religious differences, differences between men and women. And the figure of Jesus just smashed through them. And we would always cite this scripture in the church that I eventually joined. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And I never heard a story like that before. I came from a world where my family was split across because of race. My neighborhood was like virtually destroyed by racism. So to encounter another story that says people can rise above that, and to see that in action, to go to a church and see white and Black people hugging one another and calling each other brother and sister, that really attracted me. And that is what drew me to Christianity. All the other stuff about who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, abortion, hot button issues, I didn't care about that. It was the answer to all these wounds I had been feeling. And I just wanted more of that. And I guess the last thing I would say about that is this. When I would go to these Bible studies in churches, it was my first exposure to white people besides my white mom. And it was the first time I could be vulnerable with a white person, to hold their hand, to pray, to share my personal feelings. I never thought I could really quite do that. But white evangelical Christians were the first people to show me that white people could rise above racism.
So in your career, you have written mostly, as I understand it, on race, religion, and politics, at least in the latter part of your career.
Yeah, the easy topics.
Yeah, you really. And so, given what you just said, I mean, do you find yourself in your professional work just overly discouraged, or is it? Are there still these kind of signs of hope for you, or what's that like for you in your professional work?
It's strange you're asking me questions that I've really been thinking about a lot. I feel like my story is, there's this tension between what I experienced as the child of this interracial couple, in tension with what I experienced as a Black journalist. And as a journalist, covering all these big, huge racial stories in the last 20, 25 years, it's very difficult not to be discouraged. And so I have seen the same pattern again and again, where there's always a racial reckoning, where something terrible will happen to a Black person. White America will become outraged. There'll be this momentary surge of sympathy. and then it will fade away, and then we will return to the status quo. I've seen that. I've seen many George Floyds over the years. So that is discouraging. And I remember I talked to this guy once who told me, he said, racism is too embedded in the DNA of this country and of people to ever change. We'll never get past this. So I have felt that. But then I think about my family. I think about not only the courage of my mom, which she showed by coming into my neighborhood, seeing my father, which she could imagine a different America. I think about how my mother's sister and my white family changed. And I think about some of the white people I met in my church who were, raised in very racist circumstances, but changed. And so I think if people can change, so can a country. And so to answer your question, the experiences I've had as a person have made up for whatever discouragement that I might feel as a journalist. My family, and particularly the example of my white mom, is the thing that really gives me hope for the future.
You have two stories in your book that are really hard to know what to do with.
Yeah, I figured you were going to ask about this. I was wondering, okay, when is this coming?
Yeah. So I think, so with that preface, you have two stories that are hard to know what to do with. And I would rather myself not try to do anything with them, except ask you to share them, and kind of share with us how that plays a significant role in your own human maturation and growth.
So this is a story in my book about one of my white relatives that I was warned not to put in the book. Some of my friends said, you put that in there, people ain't gonna know what you're talking about. They're gonna think something wrong with you. And I would not have put it in there. I would have agreed with them if what I experienced had also not been experienced by two other people who were there with me and saw the same thing. And what I mean is this: when I was a kid, my brother and I, when we went to sleep one night, we were awakened and we saw a white man in our bedroom. But it wasn't quite a man, because we could tell that this wasn't just a normal human being, because it was I know this is going to sound strange, but it was a ghost. It was somebody who wasn't all the way there. Like half of his body was missing below his waist, but he was moving / floating around our bedroom. And we watched this, and I thought initially that I was dreaming. We had bunk beds. I was on the top, my brother was on the bottom. So I thought I was just seeing this, that it was just a nightmare. But when I awakened the next morning, I saw that this man had left evidence that he was there. And then when I talked to my younger brother, he saw the same person. And for years, I couldn't figure out, who was this white man in my bedroom? What did I see? What did my younger brother see? And then when I began to get to know my mother's family, they showed me pictures of my mother's father. And he's the one who really hated Black people. He's the one who assaulted my father when he tried to see my mom. He called him the N-word, had him arrested. And when they showed me his picture, I was like, my goodness. I looked at my brother. It's like, that was the man that was in our bedroom. And I couldn't figure out. And he had been dead long before, when we were kids. So that was part of the mystery in my life. I could not figure out why he came back, what he wanted. Later on, fast forward, I get married, and to speed up the story, my wife knows nothing about this. I mean, I didn't even like talking about my family. I wouldn't introduce her to my mom for 4 or 5 years. I mean, because I felt like it's so weird that I wrote a memoir, because I never liked talking about this stuff, because I didn't think people would believe me. But I never told about that appearance that I had, what appeared to me as a kid. We get married. She wakes up one morning and says, who was that white man over the bed last night? And I was like, who are you talking about? And she described him. And I showed her a picture of my mother's father. And her eyes just get big as saucers. That happened. She knew nothing about that. And she was mad at me. And then it happened again. So what does this mean? Why did I put it in the book? It's not a simple ghost story. What it was is this. My mother's father was this unrepentant racist in life. So he died never knowing his two nephews, never having a relationship with us. And what I believe happened is that filled him with regret and guilt. And he came back to make amends, to find out who we were, and to ask for forgiveness, because after he appeared, I prayed for him. And when I prayed for him and I prayed for forgiveness for him, he stopped appearing. So in a way, he haunted me, but I haunted him. I was a victim of his racism, but he was a victim of his racism because he could have had this relationship with us. So it's more than a ghost story. I think it showed to me that racism really scars the soul, that it violates something in human beings, and it violated in him something so much that even beyond the grave, he had to find a way to make amends. And I'm telling you, I did not make any of this up. I didn't want to put it in there. But these are these kind of experiences that are just hard to understand. And it happened on 3 different occasions. But it helped me understand that somebody I thought was an unrepentant racism who would never change, that even from beyond the grave, he found a way to make amends and change. So that really, it really helped me reconnect with my mom's family in a weird way.
Yeah.
What did you think when you saw it? Did you think I was like being allegory, like an allegory? Like, what is this?
Well, after reading the first story about when you were a child, I just thought, I just didn't know what to make of it, and I just thought I'm going to keep following the story and see what happens with this. And then when you shared what happened with your wife, I was like, oh my goodness, this is really rather terrifying.
It's very terrifying. I've had guns pointed at me, and I've had situations where I thought this is it, but I've never been so terrified, because I remember when I awakened that night, before I even knew it was in a room, I was drenched in this cold sweat. It's like my body knew something was wrong before my mind did. I never experienced that type of terror. But you know, the Bible, we're Christians. We talk about faith. There's a belief that there's a spiritual world out there. I think a lot of people have had experiences in their life where they felt like something from the spiritual world has reached out to them, or God has reached out to them in a dramatic way. It might not have been as dramatic as mine, but we believe that, this world is not all we see, that there's another world. And I saw that with my grandfather. It was very strange. I had to get to kind of know this man who terrified me as a kid. But yeah, that was part of the story.
Yeah. Thank you. You close with a sort of call to, I think you used the phrase radical integration, and this beautiful line where you say, how then could I abandon any hope that America could change for the better? My very existence is a testimony to the power of ordinary people to remake America.
Yeah.
Any commentary on that kind of as we close?
Yeah, it's such a lot in that. It's hard to, boil it down. But what I would say is that there's a writer that I like named Rebecca Solnit, if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, Solnit. And she says, action without hope is impossible. And when I look around at the country now, I see so much hopelessness, more than I've ever seen in my life. And I've been around, I've seen a lot. And I think a lot of hopelessness is that people don't feel like we'll ever change, that these racial and political divisions are permanent. Like one of the big hit movies we have right now is The Civil War. You might have heard about it, but it's this movie that portrays a future where we're literally at war with one another and destroying the country. So I think a lot of people believe that kind of future is coming. What that statement you read says to me is a reflection of that I believe there's another future possible. And my mother showed me the way. And that is that ordinary people have a lot more power than they realize. My mother had a mental illness. She was somebody that if you saw her on the street, a lot of people would cross the other way. She had never had a job, never had anything. But as I thought about my life, when she met my father in the mid-60s, over 90% of Americans opposed interracial marriage. Today, 94% of Americans across all political lines, racial lines, approve of it. And the only reason that happened is because people like her didn't wait for judges, politicians or charismatic politicians to say this is okay. They did it themselves. They went into neighborhoods they weren't supposed to go into. They went, and had relationships with people other people considered enemy. She created this ripple effect. People like her to create this world where people like myself, it's no big deal if you're interracial. And I think that says a lot about power, how ordinary people have power, and how change can come from the most unexpected places. So when I look at movies like the Civil War and I see the grim mood of this election year, I know through my mom and the fact that she helped create this world where people like me, it's no big deal, that there is another future and that ordinary people can make that happen.
We've been talking to John Blake, award-winning CNN journalist, and we've been discussing his memoir, More Than I Imagined, What a Black Man Discovered About the White Mother He Never Knew. Thanks, John, so much for your time, and
Thank you.
Thanks for your beautiful memoir.
Thank you for the honor for having me on your show and reading it.
It's been great to have you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Hello, my friends. Are you looking to find those true stories no one has ever told you about? Then you should check out the chart-topping podcast, Here's Where It Gets Interesting, hosted by longtime teacher Sharon McMahon, who you may know from her viral Instagram account, Sharon Says So. Here's Where It Gets Interesting will ignite your curiosity about the fascinating stuff that was not in history textbooks, like the sweeping history of Native Americans in the U.S., or the unknown stories that led to former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's pivotal impact in the civil rights movement. Not to mention, Sharon's joined by notable thought leaders, including former U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger and no small endeavor friend and pastor Esau McCauley, who share insights about history, culture, and politics. So get the facts and listen to Here's Where It Gets Interesting with Sharon McMahon, wherever you get your podcasts. Our thanks to the most outstanding team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.